Oh, and I said this earlier. This also goes for reacting. I mentioned this at the start of the interview and I tweeted it, but I need you all to know if you guys are trying to restream or co-stream or react to this interview and upload it to YouTube, 100% you can do that.
Thanks, Max. Hello, friends. This is Dark Scream, and today we're going to react to the interview with Max and Ian.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for those thoughts, those reactions. I think it's been overall super happy with how it's played out. Definitely, some bumps the first week, especially with scaling issues. We never really used that tech at this scale before, so we had to work out some of the kinks in the system there. But I think we went into this hoping that it would play out largely the way it had, and if it did, that this could become something that we go to in the future at the very end of an expansion. Just kind of in those last few months, everyone knows the next expansion's on the horizon. You finish the story, you finish the current expansion's content. It's just kind of a remix and a chance to revisit kind of the greatest hits of the expansion as a whole. Tuning has been definitely something we've been looking at. I think now that people have more gear, pretty happy with where that's landed. And we definitely heard a lot of feedback, especially the first couple of weeks, from Hall of Fame and cutting edge, but not guilds like your guild. That it felt too much like reprogression, and it's then we go look at logs and realize look, you guys wiped 5 times then killed the boss. That's not really progression, but I get it, right? It feels like you've already learned this fight, it feels like you've already killed the boss, you expect to just go in and win, but we want there to be a little bit of a challenge. So I think overall it's played out pretty much the way we wanted to.
So, yeah, I agree. Season 4 is lit. Well, for PvE it is. For PvP, they didn't really get anything, did they? But the raids, the Faded raid affixes, I think is just perfect. And I think they realize, especially looking at the numbers on the recent Bellular video, that Castle Nathria was just more fun than the other raids. Seems like everyone likes Nathria. I actually like Sanctum too, and I did not like Sepulchre. The first one's just not for me. But the rotation means you're never stuck there. And then M+, the way they've remixed the dungeons, I really like them. I'm weird, I liked Karazhan before the nerfs. I liked having a dungeon that felt felt like old Warcraft. It punished you. It was very punishing, and it was great. But even now, I think Season 4 Mythic Plus is fantastic. I think they hit the nail on the head with Season 4, and I honestly hope, even for not remixed seasons, that there's lessons they can take forward, right?
I think something like this for sure. I think kind of like the season, the season structure itself, we see this as a time for experimentation, and experiments aren't necessarily going to be carried forward in their exact form, but the idea of anti-RNG backstops and some feeling of security and guarantee that you will eventually get that chase best in slot item you want feels like a useful thing for us to explore. The Dinar system, I think, in terms of how upfront it is and how quickly you're getting some things, that is probably way more accelerated than we would ever do in a regular new season. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the 3-week rotation means that you just get fewer shots at getting these items. Also, psychologically, most of these are items that you already had. While it was relevant, you got your Japhis, you got your Sylvanas daggers, whatever else, and so you're having to re-earn them. I think it would, to some extent, I think more than some extent, I think it would diminish the feeling of chasing after that real trophy item if just week 3 or week 4 of a brand new tier, maybe even before you kill the boss that dropped it on a specific difficulty, everyone could just walk in and get their item. But yeah, ups and downs, and being excited about a loot jackpot has value, but feeling like you could do all the right things but never get it is definitely a bummer. We want to see what we can do about that going forward.
Yeah, so I don't know, the first Dinar 30 raid boss kills, that doesn't feel too fast to me for one item. You know what I mean? It's the later ones where they start reducing the number of bosses you need that it feels a little crazy. I mean, it would depend on the number of bosses, right? But let's say 3 weeks and you can buy an item at normal raid difficulty. I don't see that as a problem. And the currency to upgrade, I mean, it would just make sense to be Valor, wouldn't it? And just make raid bosses drop Valor. There's some friction between M+ and raid, and I think they will go over that in this interview as well. But you know what? If you've cleared a raid for a month, if they're worried about you getting final boss loot before you kill the final boss, then just make it a requirement that you've killed the boss to buy the loot, just like the vault works. It seems like a really easy answer to me.
What I'm hearing is you want to do more splits, mythic splits, more mount sales.
Now,
all of that.
This is something that always gets brought up to me, that this would honestly be something I dread about it, but I honestly think a lot of stuff that is a side effect where what we do is more crazy, that sounds miserable, I think it could be potentially much better for a lot of other people in the game.
So it could be. So I think when you talk about pugs, for sure, the rigid lockout system for Mythic is inconvenient for pugs. But I think at its core, Mythic raid difficulty isn't really meant for pugs. People will pug it later on in the season for sure, especially on bigger servers. Certainly, in season 4 like this, where the fights are much better known, the tuning's more forgiving, sure. But it's one of those things where, the lockout is an example of a little bit of healthy friction. We talk about, friction that can have social benefits, stuff that was removed when we added Raid Finder, Dungeon Finder back in the day. This is one of those examples in that joining a Mythic raid is a little bit of a commitment. And I could argue that there's an upside for pugs as well, which is that, if you're doing a Mythic Nathria pug, kill Shriekwing, and then suddenly, things aren't going great on Altamore, it's a great reason not to bail on that group. It's a great reason to not have a quarter of the group say, "Now these guys don't get it. I'm out. I'm going to find another group," because you're locked for the week. You're together with them.
You have to figure it out.
Yeah, and that, I think that actually it encourages somewhat stronger social bonds, reliance on others. At the same time, I get it if you just want to jump in and get one boss, but I think the downsides to the overall Mythic ecosystem, if we just removed that lockout and made them flex, would outweigh the upsides. And there's a reason why normal and heroic are designed to be much more inherently flexible in structure, pug friendly. That's why those work that way. That's why Mythic still works the old way.
I don't like this answer. So I pug Mythic raids, I do, and that is exactly the issue, is you can only join a Mythic raid if they're fresh, right? You would never join for the 5th boss. There's no point. You might get saved for nothing. I don't consider that healthy friction the way he describes. Now, I do get it. It makes you stick together. I agree with that part. And honestly, you could keep these restrictions maybe for the first month, right? Maybe for the first month or 2. But usually, these raid tiers have a 0.5 patch that hits right in the middle. That sounds like a great time to open that up. Really, that just seems like the simplest option here. So another thing he's not considering is bridging from being a heroic AOTC type guild into doing some Mythic bosses, because usually that AOTC guild is not going to have the Mythic raid guild structure, right? They're probably going to be a smaller guild. So they have to pug to bring people in, but unfortunately, if it's not the first boss, it can be really hard to pug to bring people in. So I think that making that more difficult for AOTC guilds to step up and step into Mythic is a problem that he's not addressing here.
Yeah, I think it's I don't think we're likely to do it right from the very beginning, though we're moving in that direction. We did it for Sepulchre before the Hall of Fame was full. I think it's likely we're going to repeat that again for Vault going forward. In general, the game as a whole, I think, is moving at tearing down server boundaries. We want to make more and more things cross-server. I think we recognize, 15 years ago, back in Classic, if you log into Classic today, you have the strength of sort of insular, self-contained communities where you're seeing the same people over and over again, and there's a lot of upsides that offset the downsides of some of these restrictions. I think in the modern game, really, server increasingly feels like restrictions without as much upside. And so we are systematically working at chipping away at all of those divisions. It just takes time. So I think when we get to a point where things like potentially cross-server guilds down the line and so forth are on the table, I think fully cross-server raids from the start will be automatic. But for now, we want to while we're working towards it, we want to make sure we're not pulling the rug out from our existing social structures. And so earlier, but not day one.
I honestly think they should just progress with the tearing down of those barriers myself, but the
there's definitely progress being made. It's something we want to do. It's not really responsible for me to commit to a time frame. I would say I would like us to do it before the next expansion.
Okay.
But it's in the hands of a lot of engineering problem solving, and just, a lot of these changes are pulling on a thread in, code and systems that have been built to work a certain way for 20 years, and realizing like, hey, this is trickier than we expected. It may be easier than we expected. We'll see. But definitely recognize there's some awkwardness, as some groups have had people faction change that want to keep raiding together, and not being able to share the same guild chat, the same guild repairs, guild bank, etc., guild achievements gets in the way. A lot of the other stuff you talked about, I think a lot of those are what I would consider bugs. There's a few that we're working on tracking down specifically with cross-faction whispers or invites. If you're in a group with somebody, if you've applied to the group finder group, if you're trying to reply to a message, like all of that should just work. Anytime it fails to work, that's a bug. But the thing we want to make sure is that there's some opt-in connection. You're not just getting a whisper from a random cross-faction person that ganked you in the outdoor world or whatever. And then also similarly, I think faction change, that's just something we need to change. Like the fact that it stomps through lockout is a vestige of how the system was built, when of course two people of opposite factions couldn't be in the same raid in the same lockout. We just nuked your old one to avoid that collision. We shouldn't be doing that now, but again, that's an example of an old system that needs to be updated.
Sweet.
Okay. All right, there's a lot to unpack there, because first of all, you can end up in a battleground against someone on your own faction because of the mercenary system. So that thing that he's trying to avoid, this doesn't need to be avoided. It's 2022, someone wants to message you, they make a character on the other faction and message you. Don't do that, but let's face it, it's possible to do that already. And I honestly think the lack of communication between the two factions is pointless, because there's a potion you can use to facilitate it. I don't know why they're obsessed with this opt-in nature. There's already an opt-in button. It's called War Mode. But I think as soon as you have War Mode off, it should just be one faction, right? That should be, you have red side, you have blue side, that's War Mode on. If you have War Mode off, you're on yellow side. None of this stuff should be in the way. But I understand they're saying it's going to take some work. That makes sense to me. Even just seeing the region-wide auction house, the bumps in the road that had taken to get online, my goodness. So it's probably best if they do it piece by piece. Listen to the engineers, they're smart people.
Yeah, so okay. Let's see, let me make sure I have
That was a
all
long
of that
question.
straight.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, okay. So I guess, so some of it is stuff you mentioned that I've talked about in the past, but I think the origins of bring the player, not the class, were like the extreme other end of the spectrum back in late Burning Crusade, where it wasn't just raid buffs, it was a matrix of party buffs. And it was, as people saw in BC raiding, well, you need a rogue in the group with a warrior to give battle shout, the warrior needs Wind Fury or they're bad, and sometimes you'd have somebody who's a good player, plays a class that's theoretically good, but you don't have room for them in your specific raid party matrix, and so they can't contribute. That felt clearly not what we wanted, and we moved away from that steadily. But I think where we're moving back towards is class mattering, making sure that the best raid composition, if you want to be optimal, is one that has representation of all 12, soon to be all 13 classes, and that's 20-player Mythic raid format supports that. I think that's something that is friendly for pugs as well in a flex raid setting. Like if you're a pug leader, you're trying to recruit the optimal group, get a group together. If you don't have a warlock, you should be looking for a warlock. If you don't have a hunter, you should be looking for a hunter, as opposed to which is the meta range spec, this tier, let me just bring 5 of them and we're good to go. That helps provide social opportunities for the full range of players. Now, that said, we want to make sure that none of these buffs feels too impactful to the point that it's like you can't go without it. It's utterly mandatory at multiple levels of play, not just the top tier level. In that case, we want to look at things like tuning. We want to look at things like alternate buff items that can provide a substitute, or just increasing availability. I think the two most classic ones in this space are Bloodlust, Battle Res. I think I was going to go without them. The percentage of classes that brings those buffs has decreased naturally over the years. That's something we're looking at changing. So a little scoop for you. I think you'll probably see this in the next beta build, or next alpha build rather. Evokers will bring Bloodlust. So we'll have a 4th Lust class in the mix. We're also looking at adding battle res to one more class. Possibly paladins, likely paladins, but don't 100% quote me on that.
Okay.
Yeah. And then for the rest, we want to take a step back and look at the whole ecosystem now that we've explored the space of individual buffs, on the class level. We don't want to close that door and say, no, we're not doing this. But it's absolutely possible that when you take all 38 specs in their totality, there's just too much of this now, and we're too close to the Burning Crusade space, at which point, over the next month, we'll want to pull back on some of those.
Okay.
But, yeah.
I think I agree with that on the class level and not the spec level. Like he said right at the end there, I think 40 specs is just too much. Everyone has their own individual buff. That's not going to work, right? But I really do like class buffs, as noted. It kind of combats the flavor of the month. If there's no class buffs, you just only bring the meta spec, and that's all you do, because why wouldn't you? I like the idea that the optimal raid, the most powerful group, is the most diverse group. That sounds like a good design philosophy to me here. So, evokers with heroism and paladins with battle res. I think it would actually make more sense if you switched those two things. Paladins have trouble getting in the right spot already, and battle res, the one drawback is you have to bring someone back to life on top of where you're standing. Evoker, on the other hand, is floaty, mobile. They already have it part of their kit. They rescue other players. So I think that makes sense. There is no plate class that gives heroism currently, so you give it to paladins. And there is no male class with battle res currently, so you give that to evoker. I think otherwise you start to have a situation where these classes step on each other's toes where they shouldn't, and the whole point of propagating these buffs is to help create more situations where people want to invite you to a group. I'm not going to say no to a battle res, but I would rather trade it for heroism. That's all I'm saying.
So you're asking us to nerf Death Grip, in other words. No.
That's the opposite of what I'm saying.
No, I know.
Yeah.
Honestly, carefully. Needed is the thing that shouldn't be something that we're building in encounters, certainly on non-mythic difficulties. If having knockbacks, having Death Grip, having a certain tool makes your life a bit easier in normal and heroic, great. And again, pug leaders, especially, pug leaders are encouraged to, it's flex raid for a reason. Look for a Death Knight. There's a ton out there who are actively looking for groups.
Mm-hmm.
Get one in, it'll help you. Philosophically, we talk about normal versus heroic. I think part of the difference there, a normal group, normal mode is pugs, but also just really casual friends and family groups that are just there to play with each other. They're not looking to bring strangers into their group. They're not necessarily looking to recruit to get a certain class or re-roll. We want to make sure that at that difficulty, you can succeed regardless. You can succeed with a very suboptimal comp as long as you have the basics covered. At heroic level, to some extent, the difference there, even if you're not cutting edge mythic, there's some challenge, there's some coordination, you care about success. You're not going to bring along a person who's doing 50% less damage than everybody else if you're failing to meet a DPS check. And so in that space, bringing in classes that can help you is useful. If it's ever literally impossible, then we're going to probably make mechanical changes to the encounter. We're going to give you more time, we're going to, make a cast interruptible. We'll do something there so it's not just ridiculously punishing if you don't have that specific class. Honestly, though, things like Death Grip, we would like more of those because it's so cool. Because it's more than just 5% damage or whatever passive buff. It lets you shape your strategy, and I think lets the player who is the Death Knight, even though they may resent having to run out and do some utility at the expense of their parse here or there, it lets them feel like they have a special role that's contributing to their group's success.
Well, that's a long segment, so I just want to jump in here and say, yes, I think there needs to be more things like Death Grip that are mechanical, flavorful, thematic, and give a class or two a certain kind of ability. Now, I don't like the idea of something that has become as powerful as Death Grip being uniquely stuck on one class, especially now that they have multiple levels of Death Grip, right? They have Gorfiend's Grasp and they have Abomination's Limb. So they can grip an AoE, or they can constantly grip an AoE. Is it really going to ruin everything if you put a grip on? Who'd be good for this actually is Combat Rogue. You make that grappling hook they have, pull a mob in, done.
ultimately, we are looking at representation across, just what the actual stats are. We want to have something we feel is a good idea, something that's elegant, that's not, it's easy to say, okay, this class has nothing, they get some new passive 3% stat buff, now everyone has to. But that feels like a cop-out, so it's like, if there's a representation problem that we need to solve, and we're coming up with a good idea, we want to move in that general direction, but, not at the expense of elegant design.
So unless they like their idea to solve a problem enough, they're not going to solve it. That's what I got from that. I mean, elegant design is good, but if you're at a point where you have certain specs that are just like 0% represented, right? Really, really low. They're really, really bad. Do something. Don't wait for a perfect idea. Now, I am in agreement. Not every class needs like a 3% whatever buff. That's a very boring way to do it. I don't know. I think they do need to look at situations in the class situation where, say, like for Paladin, the one I would know best, you're gonna have compelling reasons to have a Prot Paladin and a Holy Paladin. So then, if there's only one raid buff, why do you bring Ret? What's the extra utility, little bit of utility that spec would have? Right, so I think I want that to be part of the design conversation as well. I don't know if everything needs to be elegant. Sometimes you just gotta solve the problem, right?
But, I think we're open to it. I think part of the challenge there is also, when you think about where the scrolls are used, they're not just a raid consumable, they become, a mandatory consumable for every dungeon situation, where by definition you're not going to have class representation because you can't. And then it also starts to turn into like, well, wait, so the thing that I bring as a warrior, as a druid, whatever, is like a 2% better version of this buff where people don't have to spend gold on a consumable. Like, that just makes their contribution feel less cool. So ideally, we would want to find, a middle ground, whether maybe that's reducing the baseline power or otherwise tuning, so that it just still feels like, cool, we have this class, this is a benefit that we have, and the difference between having it and not isn't, something that you can't overcome otherwise.
I think I agree with that. I know a lot of people liked like the battle scrolls from BFA, but the reason you like them is because they let you ignore classes, right? Instead of saying, oh, well, battle shout's really an important buff, so let's give it to another class, they said, let's put it on a consumable so you can just ignore the class that brings it as well. That was not a good design, right? I think the best design is going to be overlapping buffs. So when you have something that's so critical that it needs to be there, what should happen is a couple other specs should get that buff. Maybe it should be reduced in power and impact, like he's talking about. But I think propagation is the best way to do it. Now, this doesn't mean everyone has to have everything right, but I just think when there is a core utility or a core standardized buff, it shouldn't be unique to one class or one spec. It should be probably 2 or 3 classes for each type of buff. If you did that, we'd have a really healthy ecosystem.
That's a good question. I think we've probably gone a bit too far there. And I think as we're nailing down, just finalizing professions for Dragonflight, want to take a step back and see what the sum total of that experience is. I think a lot of those examples that you gave were things that we did to make blacksmiths and leatherworkers, frankly, feel more relevant, feel like they had something that, other than the legendary crafting templates, they could sell that was part of the economy. Dragonflight is solving that problem on 5 other levels. So, a world where you need to apply 5 or 6 things, it makes each one of them less meaningful, and also just the general economic burden of doing runs, doing the content, probably gets to be higher than we want it to be.
So unpopular opinion, I really do like consumables. I think they're important. I would agree Shadowlands is a little heavy on them for little impact is the problem. Conceptually, the weapon oils were cool, but at the end of the day, they do so little. And then the weight stones are, again, so little. I would never want to see consumables go away completely. I think flasks and food buffs are standard. I think potions in combat are standard. I think if you want to give other professions consumables, you put them in the potion timer and just, you give one to, I don't know, enchanting or whatever. I will say my biggest concern would be the economy, because you really do need those things to give players a reason to give each other money for stuff. But as he said, Dragonflight should be solving that. Yet to be seen, right? You can't really test an economy. They can't really know until the actual player base gets their hands on it. But I have to say, it does look pretty good, the trade skills do.
Yes, I think we definitely have room to revisit, maybe tweak or update, or just revisit as they were if everyone loves them, a dungeon later on in the season. I think Season 2 is almost certainly going to be the other 4 Dragonflight dungeons plus 4 other legacy ones. But beyond that, I think one thing the structure does is also gives more room for us to potentially add all new dungeons over the course of an expansion. Something we would like to get back to doing more of. I think back in Legion, when we last did this, one of the quick challenges that we ran into was integrating a brand new dungeon into a pool of dungeons that the community had already mastered. Like when Cathedral Mythic Plus rolled out,
this is such a good point.
That was a super dead key for a long time, even more so with Seed of the 300.
Yeah.
Yep. And it wasn't actually the challenges, it wasn't that they were, in some cases they were actually harder, but beyond that, it wasn't that they were that much harder, it's that you were comparing a dungeon the community had 1 week of knowledge of to a dungeon they had been running, for over a year, but treating them equally in terms of rewards, in terms of what challenge they were supposed to offer. When we have all new pools, that's not an issue anymore. So I think as we look towards the later seasons, if there's new dungeons introduced, that actually naturally goes there. You definitely can revisit any favorites from the first 8 while continuing to rotate through cool legacy dungeons.
Excellent. That is a perfect answer.
So like many of you, I really enjoyed having the dungeons mixed up in Season 4. It was much better than having the same ones beaten to death in Shadowlands. But I wish they put a little more thought into the dungeon selection. When they used to bring back old dungeons, they would revamp them. They would give them a new story that fit with the current expansion. Sometimes you could still view both versions by using, say, heroic version of the dungeon, right? Remember, we made the heroic Dead Mines, the sequel to Dead Mines. I thought that concept was excellent. And when you're throwing in these random dungeons, it doesn't always make a lot of sense. I think for this, with the Shrouded affects, the Dreadlords appearing where they're appearing, does make a lot of sense, right? They have every reason to appear in Warlords of Draenor. They have every reason to appear in Karazhan. They have every reason to appear in Tazavesh. Mechagon's a little bit of a stretch, but okay. If we're going to have 4 new and 4 revamped dungeons in Dragonflight, I think they all need to be dragon-themed dungeons, or at least related to the patch, the plot. Maybe it's Twilight, Elemental guy stuff, But I think if you're just dropping random ones in, like Season 4, we go to Scholomance, that'll feel weird unless we're dealing with something that relates to that area. We're dealing with undead dragons, maybe we have to go to Scholomance for some reason, right? I think that's the missing piece from this philosophy, is that little bit of lore, that little bit of connective tissue on the story. It's a small change they could make that I think would make this thing they did in Season 4 even better. And part of the reason it's successful in Season 4 is it does fit with the story, right? These Dreadlords were infiltrating, and they have every reason now to be spreading throughout the multiverse, because, newsflash, we beat the Jailer, but the Dreadlords got away. So did Denathrius.
I think there is a key level that exists. It's definitely a different key level for Lower Karazhan than Workshop, but that's one of the challenges too. This spammability of it definitely is a factor. That's something we've grappled with when it comes to Mythic Plus loot since its introduction back in Legion. Because of how varied dungeon pools are, because of just the social factors of if someone's running a dungeon on a Saturday, we don't want people feeling like, well, I'm already locked for the week, or I've already maxed out on my loot for the week, so I don't want to run it with you. That's led us to every dungeon run gives you some loot, but of course balancing that against weekly throttled systems like just raids and PvP means that if it's too rewarding, we just completely killed raiding. And I would argue that one of the problems for not Mythic guilds so much, but normal and heroic guilds right now, is the tension between raid rewards and Mythic Plus rewards. If you're in a group progressing through Heroic over the course of a season, but half of your raid is running 15s outside of raid time, you don't really need that raid loot anymore. And that increasingly causes division within the group, even between the people who are doing Mythic Plus and people who aren't. None of that is great. So anyway, all of that said, the direction I think we'd like to move in, though I don't have specific changes to announce, is on the one hand actually trying to, between tuning and rewards, bring that baseline down a little bit, or at least bring the baseline challenge up a little bit so that there's more of more parity between raid, dungeon, PvP rewards in that space. But at the same time, find ways to let Mythic Plus players reach the top of the mountain. Like whether it's, I don't know, whether there's some level that you clear in your Great Vaults that lets you get Mythic end boss quality loot or whatever else. We'd like to make them truly equal in that sense, but there's some problems to solve along the way.
Yeah, definitely. There's also, I think this season kind of showcased what can happen to the heroic raid difficulty by having Mythic Plus available for, like, you uncapped Valor, for example, right? So if you just went hard enough and you farmed literally +2s and enough Valor, like anyone can do them, you can get full 298 gear and you will not want any single drop out of heroic basically, except for the last boss. So there's a level there balancing to where like baseline Mythic Plus. Okay, I haven't thought about it like that before. Thank you.
But at the high end, like I think there's absolutely every bit as much skill that goes into pushing really, really high keys. We should be rewarding that equally. We just have to find a way to do it.
Okay, yeah, so this is an interesting challenge because he earlier said if you're pugging, you shouldn't expect Mythic raid boss loot. So if you're pugging, I guess you're just expected not to raid at all, right? When you put all these pieces together, you start to see the problem, and I feel like looking at these problems in an isolated way doesn't work. You have to look at the whole system. I agree that Mythic Plus should be less rewarding. Yup, I said it. I don't think you should get Mythic quality raid gear for doing 15s. I think that should be the heroic level. Think about how few people push past 15s to 20s. It's probably about the same for those who push past heroic raids to mythic raids. So, if you put mythic quality, you put the top level, whether it's drops or vault or however you want to do it, at the 20 level, you put the heroic at the 15 level, you put the normal at the 10, and you put LFR at the 5, and then 0 to 5 is your bridge between normal dungeons and leveling and stuff. I think that makes the most sense to me. So I actually agree here. Although my biggest concern again is, like Ian said, if you make Mythic Plus too good, you kill raiding, and they kind of did in Season 3, because the world content was also so good. So remember, world content, if you can get up to, I think in Zereth Mortis you can get up to 252, which is normal raiding gear. So you could get up to normal mode gear, so you didn't need LFR or normal mode raids anymore for guilds who are at that level. Right? And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe people don't have to raid if they don't want to, but me, I like raiding, so I like to see when the system kind of gives people reasons to join raiding.
That's certainly one of those things we started talking about pretty quickly once initial alpha impressions came in. I think we built this system focused on Dragon Isles so that we really didn't have as many of the guardrails in designing it that we might have had if we were building it from day one as an evergreen game-wide system. A challenge here is also, not the specific mounts, the Dragon Ride, we built to support Dragon Riding. We want to be very mindful of preserving players' investment and just the usefulness of the hundreds of mounts that many people have collected. They've spent years farming up. If suddenly those mounts are consigned to the dust heap because they can't do all the cool Dragon Riding stuff, that feels like a problem. All that said, when we introduce any one of these features, our hope is that it's awesome enough that people don't want to say goodbye to it, that we want to carry it forward, for the rest of the game's future. And so far, this is looking to be landing in that space. So we're very happy about that. Recognize that when Dragonflight is behind us, when we're leaving the Dragon Isles, people are not going to feel great about going back to their old, floating at a static speed through the sky mounts. And so we want to have a solution when we get there.
Yeah, I haven't used the system yet, so I have no idea how I feel about it. I'm not a lucky boy in alpha. No alpha for me yet. But I don't think the problem he's describing actually exists. People use whatever the coolest mount of the season is. The older the mount is, the less cool it is, to some extent, right? There's some old fan favorites for sure. But mostly the coolest mount is the one you just got that was hardest to get. If you have the new purple Deathwalker, are you still running around on the red or green or dark green Deathwalkers? I mean, you might, but most people are going to use the purple one to show off what they got. It's not a problem. You're gonna do dragon riding in the open world. You're gonna keep adding mounts that do it, or you might even try to invent a different type of flying, right?
Yeah, druids and priests, we hear you. We're gonna have information soon. Apologies for the silence. I know you deserve better and you rightly expect better. Ideally, yes, we would have had just more even-handed communication across the board. The challenge is I know billion-dollar company and all, but at the end of the day, it's also a number of humans who can all just fit in one room together who are handling both the class design side of it and the community communication side of it. And life happens that results in gaps along the way. Sometimes one developer is working on a couple of classes and has one done, but they need to get the other one done because understandably players of that class are impatient, but that means in turn that they're less focused on the first one for now and are going to get back to it. And so it's stuff like that. I know sometimes it can be helpful just to hear from us that we don't have anything right now, we're working on it, we're going to have news for you in a couple of weeks, as opposed to just radio silence. And I think we all need to collectively work to get better at ever having the radio silence situation going on and people are just waiting for news.
Yeah, druids and priests and paladins, please. Okay, but it just sounds like they don't have a specialist for each class, and they need one specialist for each class, I think. They definitely need to collaborate. A lot of the good trees have seen ideas shared as they've been developed, but at the end of the day, what he's describing is a dev who is overworked and probably shouldn't be working on 3 different class trees. But he mentioned some paladin changes coming, and so I will remain hopeful. I'm going to take a hit of that hopium.
This is a question for you, for the community.
Okay.
How do you guys feel about simultaneous normal, heroic, mythic release as a thing in, let's say, hypothetical future tiers?
So for me, personally, I assume he's vaguely alluding to the release date, possibly potentially leaked release date of Dragonflight. So to avoid a holiday collision if they want to simultaneously release their difficulties, I think that's good. I think community point is, why not release LFR at the same time? You may as well. I think the way Season 4 has played out has been really healthy. There's a lot more cross-play between people who play different difficulties. And I think that having all the difficulties come out at once makes sense, even if you want to do like a week 1, first wing, week 2, next wing, right? If you want to do that kind of release, I'm more okay with that than the separated difficulties, personally. Okay, well, this was a pretty interesting interview. I'm looking forward to whatever changes we get on the alpha this week. Again, my name is Darkscream. If you enjoyed this, smash that like, and we'll see you next time.